I've watched power move in the shadows my entire adult life. Not the fairy tales they sell you in press releases, not the theater politicians perform on cable news, but the real machinery, the agreements, the institutions, the invisible systems that keep everything running until the day they don't. And right now, we're living through one of those days. What's happening with the U.S. supply chain isn't just another news cycle. This is a historical inflection point, the kind future historians will circle in red and say, this was the moment the consequences became undeniable. Because while Washington played tough guy with Canada, treating our closest ally like another country to be pushed around, Canada made a move that struck at the very foundation of the American economy, and the shockwaves are already tearing through factories, energy markets, construction sites, and boardrooms nationwide. This isn't a trade dispute you fix with a tweet. This is what happens when political recklessness collides head-on with economic reality, and it's unfolding faster than anyone in power anticipated. For over 70 years, the U.S. and Canada built the most integrated economic relationship on the planet, not out of sentimentality, out of cold, hard logic. We treated North America as one seamless production ecosystem where materials, parts, and products flowed across the border 5-6 times before reaching consumers. It worked because it was predictable, boring, governed by rules that didn't change based on whoever sat in the Oval Office. But that predictability? Systematically destroyed over the past year as Donald Trump returned with a worldview that sees trade not as cooperation, but as combat, where humiliation matters more than outcomes. That worldview just hit a brick wall. The trigger wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an ultimatum, a final demand that Canada restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies got preferential access at below-market prices. Let that sink in. Washington didn't ask Canada to fix a shortage. It demanded Canada sell its own resources at a loss to feed a political narrative. When Canadian officials saw that demand, they understood immediately. Compliance wasn't just economically damaging, it was existential. It would set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president wanted leverage. That's the line Canada refused to cross. What came next wasn't dramatic retaliation. No blanket tariffs, no emotional speeches about revenge. Canada did something far more devastating. It withdrew from voluntary supply chain coordination agreements, agreements that only work when both sides trust each other to act rationally. By doing that, Canada exposed just how fragile American manufacturing has become after decades of just-in-time systems that assume parts arrive exactly when needed and never consider what happens when a trusted partner says, "We're done trusting you." Within hours, the system started collapsing. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio got notices, shipments delayed indefinitely. Not canceled, delayed. Which, in just-in-time manufacturing, might as well be a shutdown. Construction firms watched Canadian steel and lumber get stuck at the border, destroying timelines their contracts depended on. Energy markets reacted instantly as traders realized guaranteed flows of Canadian oil and natural gas weren't guaranteed anymore, introducing chaos into pricing models built on stability. This is where the administration's fundamental delusion becomes crystal clear. Size doesn't equal leverage in integrated supply chains. The country controlling critical inputs at key bottlenecks often holds way more power than the final market. And Canada sits at precisely those choke points: energy, minerals, auto components, construction materials that American industries can't easily replace. Not in weeks, not in months. In some cases, not without capital investment that takes years. Yet the ultimatum was issued like Canada had no choice but to fold, like GDP size alone guaranteed submission. completely ignoring that modern manufacturing is fragile choreography where one missing component idles an entire facility. As disruption spread, something unusual happened in corporate America. Executives who'd stayed silent through previous trade threats started making frantic calls to Congress and the White House. Not to debate ideology, to explain operational reality. Factories shutting down within days, workers getting furloughed, competitors in Europe and Asia permanently capturing market share. These weren't theoretical warnings. They came with data, timelines, inventory counts showing how little margin for error exists. The Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements. Manufacturing associations projected hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk within weeks. Suddenly, treating trade policy like performance art had real consequences. Because when a factory stops, no narrative fixes it. When workers go home, no slogan pays their bills. When energy prices spike, consumers feel it immediately. What makes this moment particularly dangerous? It follows a pattern. Threats issued without exit strategies. Tariffs on China that required farmer bailouts. Border threats against Mexico that nearly collapsed supply lines before business pressure forced retreat. But Canada's different. The integration runs deeper, the reliance is more absolute, and the political will to submit does not exist. That combination creates a crisis you can't manage with bluster. As the administration's own coalition fractured under real economic harm, Republican senators from affected states publicly demanded resolution, labor unions warned of imminent layoffs, business leaders who once praised Trump's toughness started backing away. Not because they found principles, because their balance sheets were bleeding. This is where strength as spectacle collides with governance as substance. Dominance that produces collapse isn't strength, it's failure. The deeper problem, the one that'll outlast this immediate crisis, is that Canada's response sent a message not just to Washington, but to every American ally watching. Economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that can't be managed through normal diplomacy. Once that lesson's learned, it doesn't unlearn itself. Companies adjust, governments diversify, supply chains reroute. The world quietly builds systems that don't depend on American reliability. Because reliability is the true currency of power, and it's being squandered in real time. We're not watching a standoff between two governments. We're watching the exposure of a structural vulnerability that was always there, but never tested at this scale. The vulnerability of an economy that assumed cooperation would always exist, even while electing leaders who openly held that cooperation in contempt. The consequences are arriving faster than anyone planned. Reshaping incentives, alliances, calculations across North America in ways that won't easily reverse. Because once trust gets replaced with contingency planning, the old system never quite comes back the same. What makes this so destabilizing for Washington? There's no clean exit, no graceful reversal without acknowledging failure. The entire strategy assumed Canada would blink, that economic size alone would force compliance. When that assumption collapsed, it exposed how little contingency planning existed behind the bravado, leaving the administration trapped between two equally damaging options: escalation or retreat. If Trump doubles down and imposes comprehensive tariffs, supply chain damage accelerates. Factories already teetering shut down completely. Layoffs spread from the industrial Midwest into energy and construction. Prices climb higher. The narrative that this is temporary negotiation collapses under lived experience. Americans notice when plants close, when projects stall, when costs rise. Those aren't abstract metrics you explain away at rallies. But if Trump tries to de-escalate, to quietly walk back the ultimatum or negotiate compromise, he faces a different reckoning. His political identity is built on never backing down, threats always producing submission. That perception of dominance is central to his appeal. Any concession to Canada gets framed as proof the strongman posture failed when confronted with a sovereign nation willing to absorb short-term pain for long-term independence. The damage extends beyond immediate economic shock into institutional credibility. Allies worldwide aren't evaluating this based on press briefings. They're watching outcomes. Whether the U.S. can sustain integrated partnerships without weaponizing them. Whether American leadership understands the difference between leverage and self-harm. Inside Washington, cracks are widening. Trade experts who warned against this course are being proven right in real time. Lawmakers scramble to distance themselves from policy they didn't design but must now answer for. What Canada did, intentionally or not, was force the issue into the real economy where ideology matters far less than logistics. Once crisis enters that space, it can't be confined to talking points. Trucks not crossing borders don't care about political messaging. Energy flows don't respond to rhetoric. Manufacturing lines don't pause politely while leaders recalibrate narratives. The most consequential effect may not be what happens next week or next month, but what happens quietly afterward, as American companies redesign supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility. Sourcing components elsewhere, even at higher cost. Building redundancy instead of efficiency. Shifting investment to jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. Once those decisions are made, they rarely reverse. The integrated North American economy that took generations to build begins fragmenting, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet recalculations. Canada understands this. That's why it's not waiting for Washington to resolve its contradictions. It's accelerating efforts to diversify trade, deepen ties with Europe and Asia, ensuring no future American ultimatum carries the same systemic threat. The lesson learned isn't theoretical. It's practical. Dependence on a partner who treats interdependence as leverage is itself a vulnerability that must be mitigated. American allies are learning the same lesson. If the U.S. is willing to issue ultimatums to its closest neighbor, a country with shared language, values, the longest peaceful border in history, then no ally can assume immunity. That realization will shape diplomatic and economic strategies for years.
The tragedy? None of this was inevitable. Supply chains didn't break because of natural disaster. They broke because political theater was elevated above institutional stewardship, because complexity was treated as weakness, because dominance was pursued without regard for the systems that actually sustain prosperity and security. The people paying the price aren't the policy architects. Workers sent home from idled plants, small businesses unable to get materials, families facing higher energy costs, communities watching decades of integration unravel through no fault of their own, while those responsible remain insulated from immediate consequences. That disconnect between decision-makers and those bearing the cost is precisely what makes this crisis so corrosive to democratic accountability. When power can inflict harm without immediate consequence, trust erodes, not just internationally, but domestically. As this unfolds, the fundamental question facing the United States isn't whether it can force Canada back to the table, but whether it can relearn the discipline required to manage power responsibly in a world where leverage cuts both ways. Strength without restraint becomes self-sabotage. Unpredictability masquerading as toughness ultimately drives partners away. What Canada's refusal accomplished was exposing that reality in the clearest possible terms, demonstrating that sovereignty still matters, that trust is finite, that even the largest economies can't bully their way through systems they themselves helped create. Once that truth becomes visible, it doesn't disappear when the headlines move on.